The night Cristiano Ronaldo stopped recognizing himself, he was standing in front of a mirror in a hotel room in Turin, wearing nothing but the silence of a city that didn't know he was falling apart. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no crash, no breaking point, no single thing that happened to produce it, no injury announcement or public humiliation or private catastrophe of the kind that narratives about breakdowns tend to require in order to justify the breaking. There was just the mirror and the man and the specific, devastating quality of a Tuesday night when everything external was exactly as it was supposed to be, and everything internal had gone somewhere that external success had no address for. He had trained that morning. He had performed that afternoon. He had eaten the right things and slept the right hours and done every single thing that the version of himself he had built and maintained for 25 years did with the reliability of a machine that had never once, in 25 years, failed to show up. And then he had come back to this room and stood in front of this mirror and looked at the face in it and felt, for the first time in a life defined by the absolute, unwavering certainty of knowing exactly who he was, completely and terrifyingly lost. The face in the mirror was his. He could confirm this objectively. The jaw, the eyes, the specific architecture of a face that had been photographed more times than almost any face in the history of human beings being photographed, that existed on billboards and magazine covers and the walls of children's bedrooms in 100 countries. That was one of the most recognized faces on the planet by any reasonable measure of recognition. That face was in the mirror, and it was his. And he stood there looking at it with the particular feeling of a person who is looking at something familiar and finding it, inexplicably, and for the first time, entirely strange. He didn't know who it was. Not in the clinical sense, not in the way that would have required a doctor or a diagnosis, or the kind of language that gets used when the mind stops performing its most basic functions. He knew who the face belonged to. He knew the name and the history and the record and the version. What he didn't know, what was missing from the looking, what was absent from the recognition in a way that was new and terrifying and had no precedent in his experience of looking at his own reflection, was the person behind all of that. The actual, private, interior person that the face was the surface of. The person who existed underneath the record and the version and the 25 years of performance. The person who had been there before any of it started and who was supposed to be there still, unchanged in some fundamental way by everything that had accumulated on top of him, still present, still accessible, still the thing that all of the rest of it was built on. That person was not in the mirror. And Cristiano Ronaldo, standing in a hotel room in Turin on a Tuesday night, understood with a sudden and complete clarity that he had no idea how long the person had been gone. There is a version of the self that everyone builds, a public face, a managed presentation, a curated selection of qualities and characteristics designed to navigate the world with maximum efficiency and minimum exposure. The mask that is not deceptive in any simple sense but is selective, is edited, is the self with its most vulnerable and least presentable elements removed from circulation, kept in the back rooms of the interior life where they can be acknowledged in private without being subjected to the judgment of an audience that has not been invited to see them. Everyone does this. It is not pathology. It is the ordinary management of a social existence in a world that is not always safe for the unmanaged self, and it serves the people who do it in ways that are real and practical and often genuinely protective, and it costs them things too, costs them in the specific currency of the distance between the performed self and the actual one, and whether the cost is worth the protection is a calculation that most people make without being fully aware they are making it. That happens below the level of conscious choice, in the deep grammar of how a person has learned to inhabit the world. For most people, the version is partial. It covers some things and leaves other things exposed. The professional self might be thoroughly constructed while the domestic self retains something genuine, or the public self might be managed while the private one is allowed to be whatever it is, messy and unresolved, and in the process of becoming rather than the finished product that the public version presents. The partiality of the construction is what keeps it from becoming the whole thing, is what maintains the distinction between the performance and the person, the version and the self, is what ensures that somewhere in the architecture of the life there is a room that isn't managed, a space where the actual interior reality of the person exists without the requirement to be anything other than what it is. Cristiano Ronaldo's version was not partial. This was not a criticism, it was not a moral failing or a psychological deficiency or anything that existed in the category of things that could or should have been different. It was the product of a specific life lived under specific conditions from a specific age, the logical output of a set of inputs that would have produced something similar in almost anyone, which was not to say that anyone could have been Ronaldo, but was to say that the particular quality of the version Ronaldo constructed was comprehensible, was traceable, had a history that explained it even if the explaining of it didn't resolve anything. He had built the version at 12 years old in a Lisbon dormitory, had built it out of the specific materials available to a 12-year-old who is 300 miles from home and completely alone, and has understood, with the instinctive accuracy of children who have had to learn things early, that the showing of certain feelings in certain contexts is not survivable, not in the dramatic sense of literal danger, but in the more common and equally real sense of the costs being too high, the exposure being too much, the vulnerability being a resource he couldn't afford to spend in a context that would not handle it carefully. So he built the wall. He built it with the same extraordinary commitment and consistency and daily renewal that he brought to everything else. Built it every morning when he chose the training over the feeling. Built it every match when he channeled the interior noise into the performance rather than the expression. Built it every interview when he delivered the version rather than the truth. Built it in every hotel room, and every car, and every public appearance, and every private moment that was not quite private. Enough to allow the actual self to surface, which turned out to be nearly all of the moments, which turned out to mean that the building was nearly continuous, which turned out, and this is the part that the Turin mirror was forcing him to confront, to have produced a structure so thorough and so complete and so well-maintained that it had, at some point he could not identify, stopped being a wall he was behind and become a room he was inside, a construction so total that the distinction between the version and the person had ceased to be legible, had collapsed into a single thing that was both and neither, that performed the person rather than being him, that had the face and the history and the record, and none of the interior reality that those things were supposed to be the surface of. He had built the version so well that he had built himself out of it. And the mirror, on a Tuesday night in Turin, was the first thing honest enough to tell him. The machine had a schedule. This was the most important thing about it, the most essential feature, the thing that everything else depended on, because the schedule was what made the machine possible, was what converted the extraordinary into the routine, and the routine into the sustainable, was what allowed a human body to do what Ronaldo's body was doing for the length of time it did it, which was longer than bodies were supposed to do things at that level, longer than most bodies could sustain the demand, and which was sustained not through the transcendence of physical limitation but through the precise and systematic management of it, through the application of a discipline so thorough and so continuous that it had long since stopped being experienced as discipline and had become simply the grammar of the day, the structure through which the hours were organized and given meaning and connected to each other in a way that made the next thing always clear, always defined, always requiring nothing more than the performance of what the schedule indicated, which was manageable in a way that the unscheduled hours were not. He woke at the time the schedule required. He ate what the nutritional protocol specified. He trained when the training was scheduled, and for as long as the training was scheduled, and with the quality of engagement that the training required, which was total and complete, and left nothing in reserve, because the reserve was for the match, and the match required everything, and the giving of everything to the match, and then the giving of everything to the recovery, and then the giving of everything to the next training session was the cycle that the machine ran on, the perpetual motion of elite performance that looked from the outside like an expression of extraordinary will, and was, from the inside, something more specific and more functional than will, was the disappearance of the self into the structure, the replacement of the open-ended question of what to do with the closed and answered question of what the schedule said to do, which was not a small thing, was not a trivial psychological mechanism, was in fact the central load-bearing element of a life that would have been genuinely unsustainable without it. The machine was the answer to the question of how. How do you perform at that level for that long? How do you maintain the quality and the consistency and the engagement across a career that spanned 3 decades and multiple countries and the full range of physical and emotional and circumstantial challenges that 30 years of elite sport produces? The answer was, you become the machine. You organize the self so completely around the structure that the self and the structure become indistinguishable, so that the question of how you do it stops being a question about motivation or willpower or the management of difficulty and becomes a question about the operation of a system. The same question you would ask about how a car engine does what it does, which is not a question about the car's feelings about combustion, but about the mechanical relationship between its components.
But machines are not people.
This is the obvious statement that contains the non-obvious truth. The conversion of the self into a machine, the replacement of the open, unresolved, genuinely human interior reality with the closed and answered, and entirely functional reality of the schedule and the protocol and the performance, is efficient and is effective and produces results that are real and measurable and genuinely extraordinary. And it also produces, in the parts of the life that the machine doesn't reach, a quality of emptiness that is difficult to name and easy to misread. That looks like contentment from the outside because the machine's outputs are everything the world has decided to value, and the world therefore has no reason to look past the outputs, and that is, from the inside, the specific quiet devastation of a person who has traded their interiority for their performance, and who has made the trade so completely and for so long that they have stopped being aware of what was traded, can no longer access the inventory of the lost thing, knows only that something is missing without being able to identify what it was or when it went. The Turin mirror was the inventory. The Turin mirror was the moment the machine looked at itself and found nobody home. The symptoms had been there before Turin. This was what he understood, standing at the mirror, that the moment in front of him was not the beginning of something but the arrival of something that had been in transit for a long time, that had been moving toward this hotel room, and this Tuesday night, through a series of smaller moments that he had noticed and had not examined, had registered and had not processed, had filed away in the specific category of things that were not currently requiring action and that the machine's schedule did not have time for, that would be returned to later, at some future point when the schedule allowed, which was a point that the schedule, by its nature, never actually produced. The first symptom had arrived 2 years earlier, in Madrid, in the middle of a training session that was objectively identical to thousands of training sessions that had preceded it, same drills, same quality of engagement, same level of physical output, same relationship between the intention and the execution, and in the middle of which he had stopped, briefly and without explanation, and stood very still on the pitch for approximately 30 seconds with the ball at his feet and the session continuing around him, and in those 30 seconds had experienced something he had no framework for, which was the sudden and complete absence of any feeling about what he was doing, not the absence of the desire to do it, not fatigue or reluctance or any of the negative states that would have been comprehensible, but something more fundamental, the absence of the feeling itself, the sense that the thing he was doing was happening outside him rather than through him, that the body was executing the movements while the person who was supposed to be inside the body doing the executing was temporarily, inexplicably, not there. He had shaken it off. He had the framework for shaking things off, had used it thousands of times, had built a life on the ability to shake things off, to redirect the attention from the internal disruption to the external task, to use the task as the answer to whatever the internal disruption was asking. He had shaken it off, and the session had continued, and the moment had passed, and he had filed it in the category of things that were not currently requiring action, and had moved on to the next thing that the schedule required, which was what the schedule was for, which was what the machine did. The second symptom came 6 months later, in the form of a question that arrived without invitation during a press conference in which he was delivering a performance of the version that was so thorough and so well executed and so completely indistinguishable from every previous performance of the version that the journalists in the room had no reason to suspect that anything other than the version was present. And in the middle of delivering this performance, in the space between one answer and the next question, the thought arrived. Who is saying this? Not who in the sense of whose voice, not confusion about the speaker, but who in the deeper sense, the sense that asks about the relationship between the speaker and the words, between the person and the performance, between what is being said and what is actually true. Who is saying this? And the answer that arrived alongside the question was the one that he had no framework for, the one that the machine had no protocol for processing, the one that was going to require eventually the Turin mirror to make fully visible. I am. And I don't know who I am. He had filed this too. He had continued the press conference with a quality of smoothness that nobody in the room detected as anything other than the usual professional composure, and he had gone back to the schedule, and the machine had continued, and the symptoms had continued to accumulate in the category of things that were not currently requiring action, slowly and steadily building toward the moment when the category would become untenable, when the accumulation would exceed the capacity of the filing system, when the not currently requiring action would become impossible to maintain in the face of the evidence that the action was, in fact, urgently required. Turin was that moment. Tuesday was that night. The mirror was the filing system reaching its limit and presenting its entire contents at once, in the one form that the machine had no protocol for managing, the form of stillness, of looking, of being required to see the thing directly rather than converting it into something the schedule could process. He stood there for a very long time. He had never spoken to a psychologist. This was a fact about himself that he had never examined closely, had never asked why, never traced the assumption that underlay the fact back to its origin, never identified the specific belief about what psychological help meant and who it was for, and what the seeking of it would say about the person who sought it. He had not needed to examine it, because the not examining of it had never cost him anything visible, had never produced a consequence that the machine couldn't manage, had never required the kind of reckoning that examination requires. He had simply not done it, the way you don't do things that exist outside the framework of what your life has defined as necessary, that belong to a category of response that your particular upbringing and your particular culture and your particular version of strength have collectively defined as other people's territory. The call to the psychologist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, recommended by a teammate who had the specific courage to recommend her without making the recommendation a bigger thing than it needed to be, who had mentioned her name in the context of a conversation about performance and had not attached to the mention any of the weight that would have made it impossible to receive, who had simply said this person is useful in the way that you say a good restaurant is useful, casually and without implication. That call happened 4 days after the Turin mirror, in the specific window between the decision and the reconsideration. Had decisions of this kind always have, the window where the person who made the decision is still close enough to the moment that made it necessary to act before the distance of a few normal days restores the machine's ability to convince them that the action is unnecessary, that the moment was an aberration rather than a signal, that the filing system has been emptied and can accept new deposits, and the category of things that are not currently requiring action is once again available. He called in that window. The first session was in an office in a building that was not connected to anything else in his professional life, in a part of the city where he was not regularly seen, and where his presence would not register as significant to the people who tracked his presence. And the getting to the office was itself an exercise in the kind of logistics that famous people perform when they want to do ordinary things without the ordinary thing becoming a story, which was its own kind of exhaustion, its own kind of evidence for something that he was not yet ready to name, but was beginning to be able to feel in the specific way that you begin to feel the outlines of things before you can see them clearly. He sat in the chair that the office provided. He looked at the person across from him who was not yet familiar, who was a stranger in the full sense of the word, who had no prior knowledge of him except the cultural knowledge that everyone had, the version, and who was therefore. He understood this suddenly, and with a force that surprised him. Perhaps the safest person he had spoken to in years, precisely because she had no investment in the version, no relationship with it that required its maintenance, no prior arrangement with him. That depended on his being what the version said he was. That decisions of this kind always have, the window where the person who made the decision is still close enough to the moment that made it necessary to act before the distance of a few normal days restores the machine's ability to convince them that the action is unnecessary, that the moment was an aberration rather than a signal, that the filing system has been emptied and can accept new deposits, and the category of things that are not currently requiring action is once again available. He called in that window. The first session was in an office in a building that was not connected to anything else in his professional life, in a part of the city where he was not regularly seen, and where his presence would not register as significant to the people who tracked his presence. And the getting to the office was itself an exercise in the kind of logistics that famous people perform when they want to do ordinary things without the ordinary thing becoming a story, which was its own kind of exhaustion, its own kind of evidence for something that he was not yet ready to name, but was beginning to be able to feel in the specific way that you begin to feel the outlines of things before you can see them clearly. He sat in the chair that the office provided. He looked at the person across from him who was not yet familiar, who was a stranger in the full sense of the word, who had no prior knowledge of him except the cultural knowledge that everyone had, the version, and who was therefore. He understood this suddenly, and with a force that surprised him, perhaps the safest person he had spoken to in years, precisely because she had no investment in the version, no relationship with it that required its maintenance, no prior arrangement with him. That depended on his being what the version said. He was. She said, "Tell me what brings you here." And he said, because the window was still open and the machine had not yet recalibrated and the Tuesday mirror was still fresh enough to speak from, "I don't know who I am." He said it in the flat, factual tone of someone reporting a finding rather than describing an experience, the tone of someone who has processed something sufficiently to be able to state it without being overwhelmed by the stating of it. And she received it in the way that she received everything, without reaction, without the involuntary shift in expression that the statement produced in most people when it arrived from unexpected places, with a specific quality of neutral attention that was not indifference but was the opposite of it, was the most complete attention, the kind that doesn't color what it receives with its own prior understanding of what it expects to find. What followed was not the breakthrough that the narrative wants at this point, not the cathartic revelation that unlocks the whole system in a single session and produces a clean before and after, the moment of insight that divides the story into the confused first half and the clarified second. What followed was more honest than that and more difficult. The beginning of a process that had no guaranteed outcome and no clear timeline, and that required, from someone who had built his life on the certainty of defined outcomes and clear timelines, a quality of tolerance for ambiguity that was not available in the existing toolkit, and that would have to be built from scratch, in sessions that felt sometimes like progress, and sometimes like excavating a room that was so full of things that had been deposited there over 25 years that the excavation itself was the most overwhelming thing, the accumulation of unfiled material suddenly visible and requiring not the filing system but something the filing system had never been designed to accommodate, which was actual engagement with the actual content, the actual feeling of the actual things. He came back the following week, and the week after that, and the week after that. The machine continued, the schedule continued, the training continued, and the matches continued, and the performance continued, and the version continued, because the version was not something you could simply stop performing while the excavation was happening, because the world required the version, and the world was not going to pause its requirement while the person behind the version figured out whether the person behind the version was still there. So both things continued simultaneously, the public continuity and the private archaeology, and the holding of both at once was the hardest thing, harder than any match, harder than any injury, harder than anything the schedule had ever asked of him, because the schedule asked things of the machine, and the machine knew how to answer. But this was asking something of the person, was requiring the person to be present in a way that the machine had been specifically designed to make unnecessary. And the person, as the session slowly, painfully, incompletely revealed, had not been required to be present for a very long time. Dr. Vasquez worked slowly, which was the correct pace, and also the most difficult one, because slowness was not a quality that the machine accommodated, because the machine operated on the logic of efficiency, and the therapy operated on a different logic entirely, the logic of the thing taking as long as it takes, of the understanding arriving when the understanding arrives and not before, of the resistance being part of the process rather than an obstacle to it. She did not push. She made space, which is a description that sounds gentle and was gentle in its manner and was also, in its actual effect, one of the most demanding things anyone had ever done in his professional proximity, because the space she made was the space for the things that the machine had been keeping out of circulation for 25 years, and those things did not return to circulation in an orderly or comfortable way. The first thing the space produced was anger. He had not known he was angry. This was a discovery that arrived with the specific disorientation of finding something significant in a place you have been many times and have never noticed it, the specific quality of, how did I not know this was here? The anger was old, was not the clean, fresh anger of a recent injury, but the settled, structural anger of something that had been present for so long that it had become part of the architecture, that he had been living in rather than feeling, that had informed the pace and the intensity and the relentlessness of the training without ever being acknowledged as its source. It was the anger of a 12-year-old who had been required to be strong before he was ready. The anger of a teenager who had been required to perform composure in front of cameras before he had the internal resources to maintain composure without the performance. The anger of a young man who had been given every external thing his talent could produce and none of the internal infrastructure to live inside it, who had been given the career and not the person, the performance and not the presence, the version and not the self. He sat with the anger in the sessions, and the anger was large and was not comfortable to sit with, and was also, Dr. Vasquez said, without making a bigger thing of it than was warranted, very important information. Information about what he had needed that he had not received. Information about the gap between the life that was visible and the life that was gentle, and was gentle in its manner, and was also, in its actual He sat with the anger in the sessions, and the anger was large and was not comfortable to sit with, and was also, Dr. Vasquez said, without making a bigger thing of it than was warranted, very important information. Information about what he had needed that he had not received. Information about the gap between the life that was visible and the life that was actually being lived. Information that the machine had been running on all this time without anyone naming it, the anger as fuel, the unprocessed wound as the engine, the thing that had never been acknowledged and had therefore never been resolved and had therefore continued to produce energy that the machine could use, that the training could absorb, that the performance could metabolize into the specific quality of relentless, unsatisfied forward drive that had always characterized the career and that the world had interpreted as hunger, and that was hunger, and was also the specific energy of a person who has been given no legitimate outlet for something real and has converted it with extraordinary skill into the only outlet available. The second thing the space produced was grief. The grief was layered in the way of things that have been compressed by time and management into a density that conceals their actual scale, that looks small from the outside because it has been made to look small because the management required it to be small, and that expands enormously when the management is removed and the thing is allowed to be its actual size. There was the grief for his father, which was not new in the sense of being previously unknown, but which was new in the sense of being allowed to be what it was rather than what the machine needed it to be, which was fuel rather than loss, engine rather than wound, the propulsive energy of mourning directed forward rather than the stuck, unresolved, fully present grief of a person who has never been permitted to simply be devastated by the loss without immediately converting the devastation into something useful. He had been converting it for 20 years. In the sessions he was allowed, for the first time, to simply be devastated, and the devastation was very large, was much larger than 20 years of conversion had suggested, was the size of the thing rather than the size of the fuel it had been made to produce. There was also grief for the years. For the specific, finite, non-renewable years of a life that had been lived inside the machine rather than as the person, that had produced everything the world valued and had cost everything the person needed, that had accumulated trophies at a rate that the record books would struggle to contain, and that had, in the private accounting of the sessions, produced something else alongside the trophies, the accumulating deficit of a self that had been continuously deferred in favor of the performance that had been told repeatedly in the grammar of the schedule and the protocol and the version, that it was not currently what was required, that the time for it was later, that the machine needed to run, and the running of the machine was more important than any internal claim that the self might have had on the hours that the machine was using. Later had become now, in a hotel room in Turin, in front of a mirror that was asking for the inventory. The inventory was very large. There were conversations that had never happened. This was not an unusual thing. Everyone has conversations they have never had, exchanges that remained imagined rather than actual, the things you would have said if the moment had been different or the person had been more available or you had been more ready or the world had been safer or any of the 1,000 conditions that make certain conversations possible had aligned differently and produced the opening that the unspoken thing required. But for Ronaldo, the conversations that had never happened were more specific and more consequential than the ordinary category, because the ordinary category is about things left unsaid in the normal run of a communicative life. In the context of relationships where communication happens and some things get said and some things don't, and the unsaid things accumulate as the ordinary residue of imperfect human exchange. And his category was different, was the category of things that had never been said because there had never been a version of himself available to say them, because the person who would have said them had been inside the machine while the machine said the other things, the version things, the things that were required. The conversation he had never had with his father was the most important. He had spoken to his father, had spoken to him regularly, had spoken to him about football and family and the ordinary texture of their daily lives during the years when the ordinary texture of their daily lives still included each other, when the distance from Madeira was only miles rather than the unbridgeable distance that came later. He had spoken the words that sons speak to fathers in the language of their relationship, which was a loving language and a real one, and he had not spoken the other things, had not spoken the confusion or the fear or the weight of what was being asked of him, had not told his father what it felt like from the inside to be the person everyone had decided he was going to be before he had decided it himself, had not found a way to say, "I am doing this for you in part, I am doing all of it in part for you, and I need to know that you see that you understand what it costs, that the boy on the plane is still the thing you love, and not just the player he became." He had not said any of that. And then there had been no more time to say it, and the not saying of it had become the structure of the grief, the specific shape of what was missing from the loss. Not just the person but the conversation, not just the absence but the specific things that the absence had made impossible, that could no longer be said because the person they needed to be said to was gone, and the saying of them to the air, to the memory, to the imagined version that he maintained in his internal conversations, was not the same thing, and had never been the same thing, and the not-sameness of it was its own sustained, quiet, ongoing devastation. In the sessions, Dr. Vasquez suggested something that he initially rejected and then returned to, and then, slowly, imperfectly, in the specific way that things are done when they require a quality of courage that is different from the physical courage that the career had developed, that is the courage of exposure rather than the courage of performance, something he tried. She suggested writing. Not for publication, not for any external audience, not in the managed and constructed way of the version, but privately, in the specific privacy of the first-person interior voice that had no audience and therefore no performance requirement. That could be whatever it was without the management, that could say the things that had never been said in the language that those things actually existed in rather than the language that the version made available. He wrote to his father. He wrote in the specific, ordinary, unperformed language of a son addressing a father. Not in the elevated, public-facing language of tributes and dedications, not in the carefully constructed prose of someone aware of being read, but in the direct, sometimes grammatically approximate, emotionally honest language of someone who has things to say. And is finally, in the privacy of a page that no camera can reach, saying them. He wrote about Madeira, and the plane, and the dormitory steps at 1 a.m. He wrote about the touchline, and the feeling of being watched by the person who believed first. He wrote about 2005 and the hospital and the specific, irreversible absence that had structured the subsequent 20 years in ways he was only now, in the sessions, beginning to be able to trace. He wrote about the question that the trophies had been answering and not answering for 20 years, and he wrote that he understood now where it came from, that it was not about the trophies at all, that it had never been about the trophies, that it was about whether the person who had felt the thing on the touchline, the thing that had no name, had felt it for the player or for the boy, and that the fear, the specific, foundational, load-bearing fear underneath everything, was that it had been for the player, that the player had been the thing, and that the boy was simply the origin story. He wrote, "I need to believe it was for the boy. I need to believe that the thing you felt on the touchline was not contingent on what the boy became, that the boy himself, confused and homesick and trying so hard and not always getting it right, that the boy was enough for it, was the cause of it, was the thing it was actually about." He stopped writing for a long time. Then he wrote, I think I have always known it was. I think the question has been asking something it already had the answer to, and the not accepting of the answer has been the work of 25 years, the work of a person who needed the proof to keep coming because accepting the thing without proof felt like a risk he couldn't afford to take. He closed the notebook. He sat in the silence. The silence was different from the Turin silence. It was not the silence of a person looking at a stranger in a mirror. It was the silence of a person who has said something true and is sitting in the truth of it, which is a different kind of silence, fuller, warmer, with a quality of presence rather than absence, of something having arrived rather than something having gone. The match was 3 months into the sessions, which was not enough time to have resolved anything and was enough time to have begun something, enough time for the excavation to have cleared some of the uppermost layers of the deposit, to have made some of the inventory visible and some of it examined, if not yet understood, to have created the specific, fragile, early-stage quality of a person who is in the middle of a process that has no clear endpoint and who is therefore in a state of simultaneous knowing more and knowing less, of greater clarity about the questions and less certainty about the answers, which is the characteristic condition of genuine engagement with the interior life as opposed to the machine's engagement, which was characterized by very high certainty about the answers and a systematic avoidance of the questions. The match was not a final. It was not a decisive match in the season's calculus, not the kind that the career's highlights would return to, not a match that the record books would single out as significant among the hundreds of significant matches. It was an ordinary match of the kind that make up the majority of a season, the kind that require the full quality of commitment and engagement without the specific charge of the occasion that the important matches carry, the kind that the machine managed with the same efficiency it applied to everything, and that the person, the actual interior, sessions attending, notebook writing, excavating person, was beginning to have a different relationship with, was beginning to be present for in a way that was subtly and significantly different from the machine's presence, which was complete in its output and absent in its interiority. He took the ball in the 43rd minute, in a position that the machine would have processed through its usual sequence of calculations, the speed of the defenders, the angle of the run, the probability of each available option producing the desired outcome, and executed the highest probability response with the efficiency that 25 years of the machine had produced. What was different was not the execution. The execution was what it had always been, was the product of 30 years of accumulated mastery that existed in the muscle and the neural pathways rather than in the conscious mind, and that continued to function regardless of what the conscious mind was doing. What was different was what was happening alongside the execution, in the interior space that the machine's schedule had never had time for, and that the sessions had been slowly, incompletely, genuinely opening, a quality of awareness of the experience as experience, of the feeling of the thing rather than simply the performing of it, of the specific, embodied, immediately present sensation of a body doing the thing it had spent 30 years learning to do, at the highest level, in front of 50,000 people, with the specific quality of rightness that mastery at its best produces, the feeling of the thing working, of the intention and the execution being the same thing, of the gap between the inside and the outside closing for a moment into something unified.
He scored.
He turned away from the goal in the specific, practiced gesture of celebration that had been photographed thousands of times and that contained, this time, something slightly different from all the previous times. Not visible to anyone watching, not something that the cameras could have captured or that the journalists in the press box would have noticed or that his teammates would have been able to identify as other than the usual, but felt from the inside as the difference between performing the celebration and being the person who is celebrating, between the version doing what the version did and the actual man, present in his own body on his own pitch, allowing himself for a moment to feel the thing rather than converting it, to let it be what it was rather than what the machine needed it to be. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. It was the most honest 5 seconds of his professional life. He went back to the center circle. The machine continued. But the machine was running alongside the person now, rather than instead of him, and the person was small and new and fragile in the specific way of things that have only recently been permitted to exist, and the holding of both, the extraordinary professional competence and the fragile, new, genuinely present interior reality, was the work of the months that followed, the daily, unglamorous, entirely private work of a man who was, for the first time in a very long time, trying to inhabit his own life, rather than perform it. He went back to the Turin Hotel on purpose. This required a degree of deliberateness that was slightly absurd, arranging to stay at the same hotel, in the same room if it was available, on a night that had no professional purpose, that was engineered specifically for this return rather than as the incidental byproduct of a fixture schedule, and the absurdity of it was something he was aware of and that he undertook anyway, because the sessions had been producing in him an understanding of the value of deliberate acts, of the difference between things that happen to you and things you choose, of the specific importance of going back to the places that have told you the truth rather than away from them, of treating the mirror not as something to avoid, but as something to return to continue the conversation that had begun on the Tuesday night when the conversation had been forced rather than chosen. He arrived on a Thursday evening. He unpacked in the room. He stood in front of the mirror. The face was his. This was the same fact it had been on the Tuesday night. The jaw, the eyes, the specific architecture that the world recognized. All of it unchanged by the months of sessions and writing and excavation, unchanged in any of the ways that the outside of a person tends not to change even when the inside is doing something significant, the exterior maintaining its continuity while the interior undergoes whatever transformation the interior is undergoing, which is the ordinary experience of a life that is happening more on the inside than the outside, and is therefore invisible to anyone who is looking from the outside, which is everyone except the person living it. But the looking was different. This was the thing that was different, the thing that the deliberate return had been designed to access and that it was producing, not a different face but a different relationship with the face, a different quality of seeing, a different experience of the recognition that the reflection produced. He looked at the face and the face looked back, and what was present in the exchange, what had been absent on the Tuesday night and was present now, incompletely and fragilely, and without the certainty that would have been available if the process were finished rather than in progress, but genuinely and actually present, was the person, not the version, not the machine's operator, not the construction that the 25 years had produced, and that the Tuesday mirror had been unable to find. The person. The one who had been there before the academy and the career and the record and all of it, the one who had sat on dormitory steps at 1 a.m. and had received a small gift of company and had felt, for the first time in the new life, less alone, the one who had looked at a father on a touchline and felt seen in a way that was prior to achievement. That was about the self rather than the performance of the self. That person was in the mirror. Incompletely. Imperfectly. In the early, tentative, genuinely present way of something that has been allowed to return after a long absence and is still finding its bearings in the space that has been cleared for it, still learning to exist in a life that was built around something else for a very long time.
But there. Present.
Occupying the same space as the face, the same reflection, the same mirror, but visible now in a way that the Tuesday mirror had been too honest to pretend, that had required the months between them to produce. He stood at the mirror for a long time. He was not doing anything. He was not converting anything. He was just there, looking at the person looking back, and the person looking back was looking at him, and between the two of them was the kind of recognition that is not the public kind, not the stadium kind, not the record books kind, not any of the kinds that the career had been generating in enormous quantities for 25 years, but the most fundamental kind, the kind that precedes all the others, the kind that is prior to achievement and independent of recognition, and that is simply and completely the knowing of oneself by oneself, the self seeing the self without the mediation of the version, without the buffer of the machine, without the management that had been so good for so long and that had produced, as its most significant unintended consequence, the Tuesday night when the management was suddenly, briefly, entirely absent, and what was left was a man in a mirror who didn't know who was looking back.
He knew now.
Imperfectly, but genuinely. And genuinely, imperfectly knowing was so far beyond what the Tuesday night had offered that the distance between them was the distance of the months, the sessions, the writing, the inventory, the grief, the anger, the 5 seconds of honest celebration in an ordinary match, the deliberate return to the mirror, the distance, in other words, of actual work, the kind that the schedule had never contained and the machine had never required and the version had never suggested was necessary, and that had turned out to be. This was the thing that the mirror was now, in the Thursday evening light, making fully visible, the most important work of his life. Not the trophies.
This.
The training changed in the way that things change when the person doing them changes. Not dramatically, not in any of the ways that would have been visible to an external observer who was looking for the change, not in the quality of the output or the consistency of the engagement, or any of the metrics that the coaches and analysts tracked with the precision of people whose job was to track them. The training was still exceptional. The machine was still running. The output was still the output of someone operating at a level that the sport had produced very few examples of, and that continued to produce, in the coaches and teammates and opponents who encountered it daily, the specific mixture of admiration and something that existed on the border of incomprehension, the feeling of witnessing. Something that exceeded the available framework for understanding athletic performance. What changed was the inside of the training. What changed was what the training was for. For 25 years the training had been the answer, had been the place where the question went to be converted, where the interior noise found its external channel, where the thing that could not be addressed directly was addressed indirectly through the specific, productive, entirely honest language of the body and the ball and the work. The training had been doing double duty for all of those years. It had been developing the mastery that the career required, and it had been managing the interior life that the machine could not accommodate, and both of those functions had been performed simultaneously and mostly invisibly, in the specific way that things are performed simultaneously and invisibly when the person performing them is not fully aware of the dual nature of what they are doing, when the management is automatic and the conversion is unconscious, and the relationship between the interior pressure and the physical output is felt as intensity rather than named as mechanism. After the sessions, after the inventory and the mirror and the return and the ongoing imperfect, genuinely productive work of the excavation, the training was doing only one of those things. It was developing the mastery. The interior management had found other channels. The sessions, the writing, the slowly expanding capacity to sit with things rather than immediately converting them, the fragile and new and genuine ability to feel the feelings in the feeling's own register rather than in the register of physical output that the machine had always required. And the training, released from the burden of the double duty, from the weight of being the answer to more than it was designed to answer, had become lighter. Not less committed, not less quality, not less than what it had always been in any of the ways that were measurable, but lighter in the way that things become lighter when they are allowed to be only themselves rather than also the container for everything the person has nowhere else to put. He noticed this himself before anyone else noticed it. Noticed it in the specific quality of the session, in the way the morning on the pitch felt when it was the training rather than the conversion, when it was the work rather than the answer to the question, when it was possible to be in it as the thing it was rather than as the thing it was being used to manage. It felt, in this unfamiliar new way, like play. Not the casual, undirected, purposeless play of people for whom the game has no stakes. Nothing like that. Nothing that diminished the seriousness or the commitment or the absolute quality of engagement that every session required. But play in the deeper sense, the sense that existed before the machine and before the version and before the career, had made the training into the load-bearing structural element of a psychology that needed it to hold more than training can hold. Play in the sense of the thing being done for itself, for the genuine, immediate, first-person pleasure of doing it, for the relationship with the ball that was the most honest relationship in his life, the relationship that had been there before. Everything else, and that was still there, underneath everything else, unchanged by the sessions or the inventory or the mirror or any of the things that had changed, waiting with the specific patience of something that has always been the actual foundation and has therefore never been in danger of being replaced, only in danger of being forgotten. He had forgotten it. He was remembering it now. And the remembering of it, the returning of the attention to the thing itself rather than to what the thing was being used for, was changing the training from the inside in a way that no external observer could have named, and that was, for the person inside it, the difference between a life organized around the performance of the self and a life that contained, alongside the performance, the actual self doing the actual thing for the actual reason. It had always been there. The last session with Dr. Vasquez was not a final session in the sense of a conclusion, not a graduation, not the ending of the process, but the acknowledgement of a transition within it, the transition from the acute phase, the excavation phase, the phase of uncovering and naming and allowing the inventory to become visible, to the maintenance phase, the ongoing phase, the phase that has no endpoint because it is not working toward one, that is simply the commitment to continuing to inhabit the interior life with the quality of attention that the excavation had demonstrated was possible and necessary, and that the machine, left to its own devices, would not maintain. She said, "What do you know now that you didn't know a year ago?" And he sat with the question in the way the sessions had taught him to sit with questions, not reaching immediately for the answer, not delivering the version, not constructing a response that was designed to be received well rather than to be true, but letting the question actually land, letting it go to wherever questions go when they are genuinely received rather than managed, and waiting for what came back from that place. What came back was not a list. What came back was a feeling, the specific feeling of a person who has been somewhere and has come back from it, and who carries the somewhere in the specific way that formative places are carried, Not as a memory exactly, but as a change in the structure, an alteration in the architecture of the self that is permanent and that affects everything built on it going forward without requiring that everything be rebuilt, that simply changes the foundation so that whatever stands on it stands differently. He had been to the inside of the machine and had found it empty. He had sat in the mirror's honesty and had found it survivable. He had written to the dead and had found the conversation continuing. He had felt 5 seconds of genuine celebration in an ordinary match and had found the feeling to be the thing rather than the evidence of the thing. He had returned to the place where the looking had been honest and had found someone different looking back, someone incomplete and in progress and genuinely there. What he knew now that he hadn't known a year ago was not a fact about himself, not one of the clean, stateable, transferable pieces of self-knowledge that the world tends to imagine psychological work produces, the insight that can be delivered in a sentence and received as a revelation. What he knew was something more like a direction. A relationship with the interior life that was different from the machine's relationship, that required his presence rather than his performance, that would ask things of him that the schedule would never allocate time for, and that were therefore going to require a different relationship with the schedule, a different relationship with the version, a different understanding of what the maintenance of the wall was costing and what the cost was buying, and whether the buying of it was still, at this point in the life, the right transaction.